Good day to you. This is Anagalactic on the 20th day of January. What we have on our screen here today are a couple of electromagnetic waves, which we call light or EMR, electromagnetic radiation. We have this displayed, although you've undoubtedly seen it before, although you may not have understood it. If not, there would be a very good reason for that. It's non-understandable. You're looking at part of the quantum paradox, and in fact you're looking at part of the cosmological paradox. But today we're starting a series called Imaginary Reality, which I find to be, in one sense, oxymoronic, but in another sense, the most accurate description of cutting-edge science today. We have a case of Imaginarity that's haunting science. I have direct insight into this paradox, but rather than overwhelm you with my insights, which would take a long time to describe fully such that everything could be proved, I'll simply proceed through some known endpoints of science, beginning with this diagram, and then we'll proceed along. What I wanted you to see in these two rather simple projections is the relationship between two force fields. And we'll find out in a moment that they are indeed called that. One is called the electric field. That's shown in red on top, and in fact in red on the bottom. And each of these projections is slightly different. That is, they are different from each other, in that the top one is orthogonal to our view. We're essentially looking from the side, whereas the bottom one shows a skewed or diagonal projection with respect to the above. But they are intending to describe the same thing, and I wanted you to see these side by side, although it's vertical side by side, so that you would have an accurate appraisal of how science views light, how it views electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation can proceed through various media other than free space. But the one we're most interested in, at least in our approach, is the propagation of light in free space, which is an absolute paradox. It's never been adequately understood, and that shows up in the collapse of the wave function, which several of our top physicists have stated is the one and only problem that needs to be solved. That was stated by no less than Einstein, Dirac, but it has been stated by others, most recently by Sir Roger Penrose, who emphasizes that aspect quite emphatically, is that light has certain aspects, properties, in the way of what we call phenomena that we can measure to some extent. Light has a certain overall characteristic that is simply inexplicable. It travels through free space. You could say invisibly, but that's actually the topic we're approaching, is invisibility. So it begins with a consideration of space, which we consider to be invisible since we see through it. However, we do see through other media, such as water or glass. So we have an interesting case of permeability, in this case to electromagnetic radiation, where the maximum speed of light occurs in free space. You know that experiments were begun in the 19th century to measure the speed of light, although in fact some measurements had been taken prior to that, which is well worth studying, as is the case with any scientific development. If you have time energy, acumen, whatever it takes to, because it is work. It is most worthwhile to find the development of a scientific theory or model, or just the way we have things in our textbooks, however you would characterize that information. Sometimes is called the cutting edge, sometimes the storehouse of knowledge. We have a lot of knowledge about light, but you may have heard of the double slit experiment, you may have heard of such things as entanglement, but all of these phenomena are related intrinsically to the way light propagates in free space. Now, this has been studied in all aspects, not just in free space. Light, of course, is a very important phenomena to understand, and it certainly would be remiss of me not to emphasize that we have a huge amount of information about light in comparison with a century or a century and a half ago. One can keep going back, of course, but there's been a hyperbolic increase in knowledge in the past century, beginning, of course, with the discovery of the universe, but is also simultaneously the discovery of the atom, and then, most perplexingly, the two aspects of those two branches of science, which in microphysics goes well under the atomic level, which is already rather small, into the subatomic realm of protons, neutrons, electrons, and, in fact, photons. So those are the four main particles that were discovered. The particle soup of the Standard Model is, as I've pointed out in several lectures, something that you can completely disregard. It's a very, very narrow approach path to certain problems which are sought by certain agencies. But the model is not meant to describe physics. It's meant to describe a coveted goal. We'll leave it at that. We don't need the Standard Model of the so-called particles that mostly have emerged from proton-proton collisions at very high energy, very high speed. Those are artificial particles. They don't constitute the building blocks of the universe. Although one has to leave that open-ended until the subatomic particle physicists with their model come up with anything of importance. So far, for about 100 years, they've come up with zilch. They don't know anything. And it was really in the 1960s that the model began to be formed and was completed. It's hard to say when. They themselves say that it's incomplete because they believe they found the Higgs boson, which would complete their mathematical structure, but nothing beyond that. It makes no difference whether the Higgs particle exists or not, except to them. It will never matter to anyone else. Because it's artificial. So, besides that end of the spectrum, pardon the pun, in exploring the universe, we found a couple of phenomena that have just baffled everybody to the core. Very similar to the quantum paradox. And both of these problems were fully predictable. There had to come a moment or a point, however you characterize a turning point or that we would simply not be able to measure anymore. Now, for the edge of the universe, that's fairly obvious. You're never going to see that. But although obviously I'm contradicting a whole model, but again, we'll come to that in a moment. But it's really the redshift of light that got everything started, and the mathematical extrapolations of the edge of the universe, and the Big Bang would be the edge. And now it's considered that the edge of the universe is expanding, which of course makes no sense at all. However, there is a validity to any theory. There is always a reason, even many worlds theory and quantum mechanics where the universe splits, there is a reason for the theory. I think it's very important when trying to get orientation to a scientific topic which is so jumbled and confused and really primitive, that one at least get an overview of all the known theories. So you see how men have approached the problem. Theories are not solutions, and theories are an admission of defeat, but they're also an indication of direction. So they do have value. Even natural selection, one of the most notorious lies that's ever been composed in the evil mind of man, having no evidence behind it whatsoever, scientific evidence. In fact, it's been completely disproved. However, the idea of natural selection, biological evolution, does have a certain, I would have to say, validity. Because after all, Charles Darwin was no idiot. And men who came after him discovered that his theory made sense. And then we discovered DNA, and the case should have been closed. Although it would never be completely closed, but it should have been closed as far as validity. It's an incorrect theory. But why did Darwin think that? Well, the reason he thought that species change into each other over time, they get more complex, is because it looks like it. It's the same mistake that was made in saying that the sun flies around the earth. Of course, it does no such thing. But it's very difficult to see, if you don't already know, what is the explanation for the sun flying through the sky every day. Well, once you know it's the rotation of the earth, it's elementary, you can teach it to children with confidence. But as far as anything having to do with the universe, no such thing. And particles, the case of particles is quite different, because we can see them. The problem is that we can't probe them down to the innermost level that we would like. And now we have several mathematical theories to take up the slack, which is, I would have to say, somewhat natural, because science is intent at all times on making progress in all ways. So you want to advance your theory so that it's no longer a theory. That may mean abandoning the theory either in whole or in part. Now, when it comes to the propagation of light, I want to switch screens here so that you'll see some other material. So I'm going to switch over to that document and go down a page where we're going to be looking at this, which is taken from here. And the highlighted, the grayed area, I highlighted that. This is a web page. And you can see that that is suggested by the fact that there is an animated GIF at the top. I'm using that as a generic term. I'm not sure the technology in this case, but we used to call them animated GIFs. So you see that this shows a slightly different portrayal of the propagation of light, which has a cyclic aspect, which is missing from, for instance, the image down below, which I will attempt to highlight now. This image, I'm not sure I can get all the, well, there it is. So this image here is similar to the one we saw on the prior screen, but this one up here is really quite a bit different, isn't it? Now, you may see similarities and are able to correlate the two. They are correlated, but they are quite different visually. You'll see that there's a circle superimposed on the light wave. That is quite artificial, as in fact all of these diagrams are extraordinarily artificial. Now, one of the reasons for that, which if you're not acquainted with this, you should at least see, I'm switching so that you can see some more. For instance, this image here, which I'm just going to click on, and then open image in new tab so you can see it better. This is a Gaussian reference sphere for the propagation of light. And you see there's some interesting terms and even some equations here, yes? Now, I'm not showing you the whole thing because I just wanted you to see the spherical surface. That is intended to be a spherical surface that you're looking at. Light does propagate as a sphere, but that really is leaving out a lot. But what's really leaving out a lot is when you look at that and then try to explain it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave that open, but I'm going to go back over here and show you something else. And pardon my fumbling here, but I should have this in a moment. We've seen that, we've seen that, we've seen that. And this is the one that I'd like you to take a closer look at, because this has the information below the cyclic diagram in 3 parts, interrupted by another diagram, and then 2 more parts, making 4 bulleted items. Oops, I'm sorry. In this, I'll show you in a moment, in this, pardon me, this direction. We want to read that. There's more down here, but we're going to look at this because this is what I wanted you to see. Now, to see that better, I want to turn this off, turn this on, and just read this. And then I'll comment on it. I think you're going to learn something quite valuable from this. The topic that we're approaching is invisible reality. Bear that in mind as I describe what scientists say to describe the propagation of light. A rotational motion is relative to its own axis of rotation. I'll disregard that for now. That probably makes sense to you. You saw it in one of the diagrams, the cyclic diagram. There is an axis of rotation. So what's being said here is that there is a rotational component in light. It may be felt merely as a force, where the lines of forces may originate from one end of the axis and terminate at the other. That would be a linear force. This is like a magnetic force field. That's not true. I'm not sure why that's even stated. I'm extrapolating. I think I see why that was said, but it's quite improper. So bulleted item number 2 talks about force fields. Light consists of magnetic and electrical force fields. 2 force fields. Change in one field generates the other field. Change in one field generates the other field. That's described by the Maxwell field equations. Change in one field generating the other field makes no sense. That actually has no meaning. Change in one field generates the other field. How? It's not stated how, it's just stated point blankly. So the third item is the magnetic and electrical fields oscillate in phase, but normal to each other. This has to do with orthogonality. It is as if space splits into these 2 fields. That's correct. That's what I wanted you to see. It is as if space splits. Let me ask you something. According to yourself or to science, or to you if you have a theory, or to science if you know what science says, how many dimensions are there to space? I think a certain percentage of people, if they were given a multiple choice, and one of the choices were 3 dimensions, that might be chosen. But you already know that that's been extended by Albert Einstein to a 4-dimensional space field. It is space that Einstein composed. It's a new kind of space. It adds a characteristic to space. But one must actually be more specific, and the statement is not quite true. So how many dimensions does space have? If it's overlaid with a Euclidean grid, X, Y, Z, it's called 3D linear space. And that's just a grid. If it's 4D hypercubic spacetime, it's a hypergrid, but it's still a grid. And time is forced into a relationship with space that it actually does not have. But then why does the equation work? That's part of the quantum paradox. And you're going to find as we proceed through our series, which will cover several video lectures, we're going to proceed into imaginary space. Now, you may have heard of imaginary space in the context of the complex plane. The term imaginary there is really an interesting use of the term imaginary, because in one sense it is imaginary, but in another sense it certainly could not be imaginary, or it wouldn't even work. You can't have imaginary anything in science. It has to be real. So what is meant by imaginary? It means we're going to find out better than any other physicist has yet discovered what that means. But in order to get at the source of the paradox or confusion or misconstruction or simply incomplete model of light, we're going to need to understand more fully the history of this discovery, beginning at James Clerk Maxwell. And the most important aspect of the Maxwell field equations is that it describes a geometric relationship between the electrical force field and the magnetic force field. They're perpendicular, which is a remarkable thing to find out, because perpendicularity is the basis of algebra. It's essentially the basis of linear mathematics, which is the only form of mathematics that's ever been used, is linear mathematics. And complexity, the complex plane, which is touted to be not... Well, there's several ways of characterizing complex space, which mimics the problem in physical space, but nobody knows how. The two fields are shown as manifesting themselves perpendicularly, and you can see it, although not in the top diagram directly. That's showing the cyclic aspect, which is quite fascinating and leads us into imaginary space, such that it's measurable and comprehensible. I cannot say I've ever found anybody who's been able to describe the propagation of light in fully comprehensible geometric terms, because the basis of the propagation has never been discovered. I discovered it. So that will be the entry point into our discussion of imaginary space, that it's more real than real space. It's more real. And the reality that we see is one aspect of two realities. And you may notice that this indicates a split in the universe. That's right. This is the solution to the many-worlds theory, to show why the many-worlds theory was developed. It was a probe which seemed to explain a lot. It didn't explain enough. That's why it remains a theory. But the many-worlds theory can be disproved rather easily once you know the true source of the split in the universe. It's a split in space. So to answer my own question, how many dimensions does space have? First of all, the word dimension has to be disambiguated, because there's several uses of the word dimension. What is almost always meant is linear dimension. Linear dimensions, which is the grid, not physics. It's not physical space. It's a grid, so we can get coordinates. That's why we use a linear grid over space, and we call it 3D, but obviously that's artificial. It's interesting, though, because in every case there's a superposition. When we say that space is 3D, that's true. In the system you're using, if you're using lines, you can only fill volume space with 3 lines. If you want more, you're going to have to use an imaginary vector. Isn't that interesting? So Einstein does use imaginary space, and in fact I've shown that it is a form of complexity, and what complexity means is you split your number system into two number systems. So that's a lot, and that's 25 minutes. I hope this entices you to watch the Imaginary Realm series. The title that I came up with this morning, but it's not perfectly final. I just want you to know what my tentative title is, certainly for this lecture as I release it, is the Realm of Imaginary Reality. Now I've decided to shorten that. The realm of is from Edwin Powell Hubble, the realm of the nebula. The realm of the nebulae, it's plural. And I wrote a book called The Realm of the Cumuli, which was burned up in the campfire. The rather sad loss from my aspect, because it was a 450-page typeset book with a lot of diagrams that I worked on for a long time, because I'm a galactic astronomer. So that's interesting that we have several aspects on this fantastical realm called Imaginarity. Well, what is it? Is it real? So the title of this has been abbreviated from the realm of, just drop those first three words. Imaginary reality. Does that sound like an oxymoron, a direct contradiction? That's the quantum paradox. I've come up with, over the past few months, I've come up with several characterizations of the quantum paradox that are, in my opinion, superior to anything that's ever been stated. But it's a virtual tie which one is the best, because it does remain a paradox down to a certain level, which has not even been achieved yet. I've gone down an extra level or two to find out what the problem is. Why is this such a pernicious paradox? It's not just one either. It hits us everywhere now because we're probing limits. And that may remind you of the calculus. Oh my God, we have a lot of discovery ahead that I just wish to emphasize for the sake of my scientific course, is that only I know this. Only I see all these things. Only I can prove what the answers are. But I did definitely get all the answers, and it goes much farther than I've been able to describe in this brief introductory lecture. It would be hazardous for me at this point to guess how many major discoveries I've made over the past 3 years. It would sound grandiose, and it would sound pretentious and a lot of other negative, perhaps even megalomaniac. So I leave you with these tantalizing insights into imaginary space without having gotten very far, because in science it's extremely important when doing work as we are at the edge to make sure of your foundation, that we're all on the same page. We're dealing only with provable facts until we get to the edge, and then we go forward knowing where we're at. That's called orientation. All right, so I hope you enjoyed what little there was here. I enjoy giving these video presentations, but it's time for me to rest a little and prepare another. This will be an indefinitely long series on imaginary reality.